start. It should be starting here any minute now.
There it goes.
Alrighty. So we are recording this meeting, so everyone please be aware of what you do say and things Ben will be posting it on his YouTube site, and it will be available for everyone who wants to check it out. So on that note, have at it. Go ahead.
Great. Glad everybody could make it. I'm going to share my screen and see if we can make this work. Maybe. There we go. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. And let me make sure that I have the right things going on here. There we go. All right. So the previous 2 nights, we went through some basic stuff, not basic, but we went through some build on stuff that helped us to get to the point where we understand how to set up our environment, how to get things going. Last night, we went into some modules, showed you some modules. I'll continue that a little bit today to finish off what we didn't do yesterday, and then we'll dive into some code or to some functions that you can build on your own to do work that can either combine your script or your methods to modules and kind of marry them up. The whole goal is to help you see how you can do some work and get some value out of it without having to write a lot of code. But I will tell you, once you get past the beginner stage of using PowerShell, you're going to want to learn how to do syntax and functions and stuff. And I'll show you some of that tonight. Since this is an advanced session, we're going to go into what makes up a function and how it looks and why you care. I'll show you a couple of examples. The one things we didn't talk about in the first day and the second day are the pipeline. And the biggest reason we didn't is because the pipeline should be understood in the beginner stage of PowerShell. So if you have any questions about that, we can certainly dive in, but I want to make sure you understand that we are going to be a little bit, we're going to assume that you understand a little bit more of the beginner stuff so we don't have to go over it. So yesterday we did a demo with DBA checks, and what I didn't do correctly when invoking it, I actually did the DBA checks and I showed you how they came back and said, hey, this is what your instances had. What I didn't do is I didn't pass through and update the DBA or DBC Power BI data source. So when you do this particular idea here, it actually creates a file and it actually will tell you in your output that file is done. So I'll run it and I'll show you the output when you actually do it correctly so that we can get an idea of how it actually works. But we'll run this behind in the scenes. I have a PowerShell window open here that we can run it and show you the output. So I'm going to start it now just to let it go. But I do have the output from yesterday. And the output from yesterday, I just clicked refresh and it went out and grabbed it. And so I have all my tests. There's 1,048 tests that ran, 830 was successful, 218 failed. It ran for, it says 0.27 minutes, but I will tell you that's not true. It ran for about, I would say about 4 minutes, not 0.27 minutes, maybe 0.27 hours, maybe, but not that small. But anyway, you can see 79.2% success and 20.8 fail. It shows you some detail in this little guy. My environment is default. I only have one. I could have multiple environments if I wanted to. But it's basically going to tell you categorically where they failed. So your agent alerts are here. you failed 39, or total tests were 39, you failed 36, and mostly because these are brand new instances and don't really have any alerts configured, so that's terrible. If you click the Power BI thing here, it focuses on them, and here's your errors down here. If you click on it again, it will unclick it, and then you have all your messages down here. So if you wanted to drill into each one of these are foreign keys and check constraints not trusted. I could click here. There's 185 tests, 12 of them failed, 173 succeeded, but it comes in here and tells me that there's some foreign keys that are invalid. And the failure message expected true, and the explanation, because this can have a huge performance impact. And then it will tell you, but got false. So it expected true, but got false. So it is an error. It's a failed test, and it will flag you on that. So it's kind of cool. When you click in this window, it also changes this. You see 185 tests. You see 12 failed, 173 success, which you see here. So everything is good. When I uncheck it, it goes back to the global 1,048 and 79 and 20. So this is a kind of a good way to get a clean bill of health. If I were to go out and I were to fix these things and I ran DBA checks again, it would then let me see that. Oh, sorry. It would let me see that this is all green, and I'd see 100% success. And once that takes place, every time you run it thereafter, if you get a failure, something in your environment has changed. So it is kind of handy to have this type of scenario. Microsoft did kind of the same thing, except DBA checks, you do it a little differently. So DBA checks will actually let you omit some checks or run your own checks, and it will report on them. Microsoft has a SQL Server vulnerability assessment in their SQL Server module, and that will let you actually baseline things. So instead of omitting checks, it's kind of the same, but in a different syntax. Microsoft's vulnerability check will let you create a baseline, and every time you import that baseline and then run the assessment, it will take into consideration that baseline and won't flag you when there's something that's wrong or something you've accepted. And then if anything comes back on that after you've properly baselined your environment, then you know something has changed, and it will tell you what's changed. So there's some really cool tools that will help you give yourself a health check on your databases. And sometimes that's all you need. Christy Lemaire used it when she was working. I think she still works for the government entity over there. The name is escaping me, but it's a big one in the world. And she basically was required over, hundreds of servers to produce this output that showed that they were in compliance. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. She ran this, got the clean bill of health, and it was a beautiful day when she didn't have to go out and run queries and do all these things, and just got to run the DBC check thing. So it's really kind of cool. So we did the little export Excel. I will show you. Wow, tonight is just a night, I bet, because I've been sleeping. The expanded things we'll hopefully get to tonight later, to color some cells, but I'll dig that up in a minute. But to follow on to last night, we're going to do a couple other things. So we'll go into our window since we have a transcript running, and we're going to, and notice I have my commands that I ran last night all in my up arrow, because that's the way PowerShell works. But one thing I didn't show, which I need to show, is the, let's import DBA tools here, because DBA tools likes to have itself loaded before the SQL Server module loads. And you'll see that I'm using an alias because I'm on the command line. Instead of typing import -module, I'm doing IPMO. That is the alias for that. And I'm going to go into the provider here because I can. And I'm going to show you what I forgot to show you yesterday. So I'm in here, and my path is the SQL Server that I'm on, instance 1. And I'm going to go into databases to show you that I have databases. And the one big powerful piece that is a lot of times ignored is the provider context. Now, most of the commandlets that abide by the provider context actually have a parameter that lets you suppress it. Now, each thing we're going to just do backup SQL database. And I should actually be doing this in my window because it's low down here on the screen and you guys don't need to squint that way. So we're going to back up SQL database, and it does have parameters: database, server, instance, and I could go and set my server instance up and say I'm going to back up these databases. I'm going to just back up the database Ben, and that's really all I have to execute. But notice that encryption was requested at the media was yeah, the other problem is that if you've done backups already, then it gets a little dicey for SQL to back up. By default, what happens, I'll show you what happens so we can rectify our demo. If I right click on the instance and go into database settings, it shows me where my backup is. And we'll go to this path because we want to, well, come on. We want to go in and see why it's having a cow and why. Bear with me just a moment. I'm not sure why this is happening. It does not like what I did. Oh, it's really weird. Let's go to D anyway. This is what we get when we do demos, and I will apologize up front because I have been slammed all day and didn't get a chance to do everything I wanted to do for this, but we're going to still do it anyway. Oh, that may be why. Because it's protected. And you have to go do this silly thing before you can see it. So there's already a ben.back, and when I backed that up, I backed it up with encryption, and that's not helpful. And in an encrypted backup, you actually can't run backup and have it back up to the same file again because it's against the rules. So we will go back to our Azure Data Studio and we will back it up here. Now I'm going to go out of my provider here. We're going to back this up, and really what will happen is it will put a file in here called ben.back. So I don't have to specify where my path is or anything, and it will just do it. But notice this guy here where you have a server instance already. I'm going to delete this backup here. And you shouldn't do this in production. You all know, don't delete your backups willy-nilly because that's really a bad idea. But in this case, the database Ben, how important can it really be? I mean, really, let's just cut to the chase. So I'm going to execute this, the same line. I'm going to omit the server. I'm just going to take off the server. I'm going to go down here and go back into my SQL Server drive. And I'm going to run this and see if PowerShell understands what I said. And sure enough, if I go back into my folder, there's a ben.back. Now, how did it do that? Well, this is what they call provider context. So when you are inside the provider and you're at least the instance level, it will actually reach into the provider when you run a commandlet out of the SQL Server module. And if you're trying to back up, or if you're trying to do there's a couple other things that use provider context, you all of a sudden just get that for free because it knows you're in the provider, and it just says, well, I'm just going to infer the provider context. Now, it used to tell you that it was using the provider context, but notice how it doesn't. It just doesn't. And you might think if I go in, let's go into Ben database. Now my provider context is Ben. And you would think you'd just be able to say, you know what, we're just going to back up SQL database. But there is a problem when you try to use too much context. And the too much context is it always wants you to specify a database. So what if I wanted to back up all my databases? I could actually come back in here and I could do this. And I don't have to specify anything else, just this. So I dir, because I'm in, oh, let me go back into my databases container. There we go. And I can dir and do a pipe to backup SQL database. And now everything is known by SQL because I am in a database and the database is connected to a server. So all of a sudden, it just backed up all of my databases for me. Now I could, now notice I didn't do a for each either. It just piped the list of databases. But what if I wanted to do master model and MSDB? I could do force, right? And what if I wanted to compress? I can add options. So now if I run this guy, I not only get, oh, except it doesn't like it because it wants to put a different type of backup in this file. So let's delete these. Don't try this from production. Come on. And now it backed up all of my databases here. Master, model, MSDB, demo, Ben, and it missed one called TestDB, and I can't tell you really why, because that doesn't make any sense to me. Let's see what it says. Backup and restore options are not allowed on TempDB. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Oh, that's why, because it threw an error, and this error says the pipeline has been stopped. So because it couldn't back up TempDB, test database was after TempDB because TES is after TEM. So it stopped the pipeline, and I don't get to do the backup of test because of that. So I'm going to delete the things again, and I'm going to do a dir with a force. We're going to do a where and say where name not equal to TempDB. Then we're going to pipe to backup SQL database. And I'll just tell you that you do not have to be in the provider here. I am in the provider, but I will do C. No, I actually have to be in the provider because I do a dir. So I do have to be in the provider, but it did accept the parameters coming from the database. I could actually be outside the provider context here and do a dir of the provider context. With a force and still back up without the provider context. The difference is that I don't have to. I can actually be in the provider context and it will do everything I need to do. And here, sure enough, now it backed up everything and didn't error, and I get my test backup as well as my other backups. So this is the provider that gives you the ability to pipeline things into other commands. And that's what Microsoft banked on, is the ability to use the pipeline. And that way, my backup SQL database, if I wanted to make sure the names of the files were different, I could start tacking on the backup device. I could do a backup container to change my location. I can do my backup action to change it to be a diff or a log. I can change my backup file to be multiple files. or I could just change my backup device. I would have to create a new backup device to do that. So you'd create a new backup device object, but typically you'll either use file or you'll use a backup container to change your location for where you put them. But you can do all of that in the command here and still pipeline and do things like that because you can add parameters. So I wanted to show you the the provider for the perspective of the provider context for functions that are in the SQL Server module, because I think that's one of the more powerful tools that you get when you want a down and dirty thing. I don't think it's anything you're going to be doing for, major production work, but think about the principle of somebody has a SQL Express instance, or somebody has really a SQL Express instance, or another instance, even if it's web or other things that you just need to take a quick backup of, just a quick snapshot. You don't want to worry about setting up a job, but I need this backup. Now I could say where name is something and only do one, or I could do get item and do one. But the big deal is that I can just pipe that to backup SQL database and it will create a backup. And I can even govern where it puts it. So once I do that, once I know that I can do this in SQL Express, I just go dir and point, and it doesn't have to be local. Like I said yesterday, you don't have to do local bendesk. I can do a server name and the instance of default, or an instance name of another server somewhere else. And as long as I have permissions as the user I'm logged on as Windows authentication, just like I'm using SSMS, it will go and connect to that server and do a dir and then pipe it to the backup SQL database. So really nice thing. All this does is send the backup command to SQL, right? Because it's smart. And it will use the server that's coming from this guy. So not a bad thing. But just know that you have tools that you can get things done without having to worry about writing code. This is just a command. The code is a little different story. Now, the other thing I forgot to show you, and DBA Tools has this different function name, and so does Microsoft has this as a different function name. But basically, the ability, and I teach this in other classes, but imagine that you want to persist data when you do a select statement. So I come in here and I say, I just want to persist select star from sys.indexes, and it might actually not have any. Let's see if it does. Okay, it does. It has 164 rows. So I want to persist this into another table as a snapshot. So I forgot to show you this guy where you can invoke SQL CMD. And again, there's invoke DBA query. So same principle. My server instance is bendesk instance 1. My database is, we'll just do, where am I at in here? Let's see. I'm in Ben. So let's do Ben. I can do a credential if I need to do a SQL login, but in this case I don't. I'm just going to select star from sys.indexes. Then I'm going to say output as, this is the critical part, output as, and I'm going to output as they do have options. Data rows, a data set, or data tables. So I'm going to do data tables, and I'm going to say results equals. Now, when I execute this, it runs. Now, invoke SQL CMD will also honor context. If I was in the context, I would not have had to specify the server instance. I don't believe they've modified this. I'm going to go back into the SQL Server provider context, and I'm going to go into Ben, and I'm going to say invoke SQL CMD, and I'm just going to say query. And this particular command does honor the database. So I'm going to show you DB name. It does honor the database. It's about the only one that does. But the provider context would allow you to do an invoke SQL CMD and accept the provider. Now, this is what I was telling you about. Warning, warning, using provider context server equals this, database equals this. I can say suppress provider context warning, and if I do that, I no longer see it. So if I don't want to see it, I don't have to see it. Should I do that? Okay, I guess. I mean, if you don't want to see it, it won't affect your result set, so that's not a big deal. But we're going to take this guy and we're going to invoke SQL CMD. We're going to do that. We're going to do select, and we're going to get us some data. Now, it says it still used the provider context, right? So I either need to get out of it, or I need to accept that if it was different, if I was going to instance 2, it would use instance 1 because I was in it. But notice it didn't use the database because I specified database. So again, there's overrides that you can use. But anyway, results dot get type, which we saw yesterday, and it says that I'm a data table and just one data table. So I'm going to write SQL table data, and I'm going to do server instance of Vandesk's instance 1. I'm going to do database, and we're just going to put it back in Ben. And the only other thing I need is the, I do need to tell where to put it, right? So table name is going to be, and I think there's a schema too, yeah. So table name, I'm going to put it in sysindexes Ben. Schema name is going to be DBO. And notice I mix and match, so I didn't have to put quotes, but my schema name's that, and the only other thing I need to do is put my input data, and that will be results. Okay, so now I have this write SQL table data, and we're going to run this guy, and it errors. Well, because the table doesn't exist. So if I'm going to ETL anything like this, I'm going to have the table exist, or I can be a Jedi again and use the dash force, and it will actually create it. But I'll show you why you don't really necessarily want to do that. But it's great for a quick and dirty. I can tell you, it's great for a quick and dirty. The columns are anything that was a string. Oh, yep, there it is, right. The filter definition comes in as an nvarchar max. For any string, it's an nvarchar max, and type description nvarchar max, even though we know that's not true. A name is nvarchar max, even though we know it can only be 128. But that's what it does on a force to make sure that it doesn't create a table that has a smaller data type than the data flying in the pike. But now if I right click and do select top 1000, I see my data just as if. Now it won't create primary keys and it won't create this. So it's better if you're going to write SQL table data to or using the invoke, or I mean the write-DBA DB table data, you'll want to put it into an existing table and have your keys on there and everything like that. But for down and dirty, this is quick. Even for ETL, you still have the ability to put all the stuff in. The advanced part is not using force. The advanced part of this is that you have to understand what it's doing under the covers so that you don't push your head against a wall for a long time. The keys here are that when you use these functions to put data in, it always auto maps. So think of this like an SSIS package where you pull in a query and you push out a query and you get to map them. In this case, it's auto map, and it auto maps by column ordinal, not by column name. So if I put index ID as the first column in my select, it will put it in, I guess it will put in an object ID because that's the first column. So anything you do to do a query like this guy, and we did select star from sysindexes. Anytime you need to interject, say you have a table with a column that is a primary key and it's identity, or it's got a sequence, it's got a default on it, and you don't want to mess that up, you would need to put null as call1 in the front of that, so that that null is not tried to input into that column. Now, all other columns that have nulls and they map, that's fine. But this is a rule that the SQL bulk copy API allows, and that is if you put a null in here, then it will bypass that if it's got identity on it, or if it's got a default on it, or it's got something else, it'll just bypass it. My recommendation for those that are hardcore data gatherers using these mechanisms is that you put your identity columns and your auto columns at the end of your table so that you don't have to map them. So if I had my identity column, I wouldn't have to do this. And if I had 20 columns in my table and 2 of them are identities or sequences or whatever, they have a default, and I don't want to have them be affected, I can put 18 columns in the select statement, and when I dump them in, it will map the first 18 and ignore the other 2. So that's what you have to know in when you start moving data around using these in write SQL table data or the write-DBA DB table data. You want to make sure that you do what you should do. Now, another thing I'll tell you about these guys is that this particular function inside the SQL Server module, if you decided that you were going to pass in an array of something, it's iteratable, so you can iterate over it, but it is not a data table. What SQL Server module will do is it will convert that data into a data table first and then push it into the table. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but if you have 100,000, 1,000,000 rows in that select or in that import CSV, it's going to take a while, and it's going to take a whole lot of RAM because you're going to have 2 copies of that data in RAM. 1, the data you passed in. 2, the data it converts into a data table so that it can shove it into the table. So best practice rule for this guy when you're starting to use advanced functions like these to do more work is to take your results that you're using for input data and ensure that they're in a data table object. And then it will notice, this command will notice it's a data table, and it will not convert it. It will just start shoving the data down the pipe. Okay, so just be aware that that's something as you start getting more advanced into your PowerShell world for DBA stuff. There's many opportunities for you to grab data and want to stuff it into a table for historical results. We'll see a little bit more of that later when we start talking about the functions that you can build and how you leverage modules in the functions, so you don't have to write most of your code. You only have to write logic code, but that's going to be important for you later. All right, so that concludes yesterday's things I forgot to take you through. Now, one other thing we didn't do yesterday that we alluded to is we showed you the idea of using a credential. And we have this, okay, so it wasn't in here, it was in my sample here. I created a credential called instance1 cred, and I got the credential, I typed it in, and then I exported, because we have this export PS credential here, I exported the credential into the same location into an instance1 CLI XML, and my credential was what I gathered here. I could do it all in line. I could just done parenthesis get credential, and I could have typed it in then. But I wanted to show you how you did this to set your environment or you set your automation up. So once I exported that, and here it is right here, I'll show you what it looks like. This instance1 at CLI XML. It is a text file. It's client XML stuff. And actually, I should probably not use Notepad++, but I did anyway. You'll notice that it comes in here and tells it that it's a custom object and it's a system object. And then here's my encrypted password, and it's all encrypted with DPAPI. And what you will want to do to test it is you'll want to log into another machine, and try to import it. Even as the same user, it will not import and be able to be used. The drawback to any of this using credentials is that the credential itself, the username, is actually in plain text. And in most cases, even in a scheduled task, in anything that has a credential, the only thing that actually gets encrypted, unless you manually encrypt it, which you could do, is the password. The username itself will never get encrypted. And the only place I've ever seen it encrypted in a Microsoft world is in the ASP.NET when you encrypt a certain node of the web.config. You can actually tell it to encrypt your credentials, and it actually will encrypt the whole dang thing. It's not even just the credential, it's actually the whole group of underneath that XML. You get the whole node that is all encrypted and is only undoable to be used inside ASP.NET and on that machine that you encrypted it. It uses the same principle of DPAPI. But just know that if you don't like this, that the username is unencrypted, then you may not be able to leverage the idea of having a import PS credential to use. But basically to get it, I just do new cred equals path equals instance 1. I imported it, and why does it not? Oh, because I'm not in. See, I'm not in my demos folder anymore. There we go. I'm in my demos folder now, and now it will recognize it because I used a relative path. I should have used a complete path, but I didn't. So now I imported it, and now I can type in new cred, and you'll see that even this shows the username, and then it says it's a secure string. Okay, so kind of weird. And the other thing is that you can't get that password back. So just know that it's encrypted for you. And I was able to get it back because I exported it as me, so I could import it as me. But this new cred can actually now be used in my SQL credential, and it actually does work. So if I run, let's see, let's make sure that all of this code gets ran so that we can use it in a minute. Oh, it didn't like that. Where'd it go? What didn't it like? Oh, because okay, never mind. Let me do that. Let me get rid of my files here. Instance 1 client XML. And we'll go, hey. All right, we'll run it again because and then we'll do the get credential thing that it asked for right here that I neglected to do because I was being silly. Oh yeah, I have to highlight all of it. Here's my credential. And now it saved it out here. Here's my instance 1 I just created. And now I'm going to actually run a command that has get-dba database. And I'm going to splat this hash table. And the hash table has a SQL credential parameter, and it passes my new cred in. We're going to see if it actually works. Get-database and instance 1 with cred. And sure enough, it gets my database. So it does work, and I don't think it tells me that I'm in SA in this one. The SQL Server one said, you know, connected as, but right here it doesn't. But it's pretty cool. I will tell you one little secret that maybe I shouldn't because we're recording this, but I will tell you anyway. If I were to get that database, and I were to go, let's go out here, and I were to go db.parent, I'd have my server. And there's my connected as, SA. If I were to say db.parent connection context, the drawback here is there's my password. It might be a bug, but after you stop laughing that it's there, we'll have to figure out a way to not get it to be so obvious for people who don't want their password exposed. But it is something that is important to understand when you start messing with credentials. The connection context does have an ability to only set this guy, the secure password. For some reason, this module puts the clear text password, and I will work with the writer of get-dba database to unexpose that password, because there really isn't any need to have it exposed. Now, if the connection context object, I just discovered this yesterday when I was playing around with this, or Monday actually, and saw that it did show the password. It is a little weird, but I don't know if I'll have to look inside the code to this get-dba database and see what it does, but it shouldn't actually do that, because I can actually only specify the secure string when I'm connecting that way, and I would have thought this one would have done it too. But anyway, just so you know, be careful, because if you use SQL authentication a lot, before we get this patched, just make sure you record the version that you're running so you don't get caught in a bad place. All right. So that's credentials. That's fun. The export and import PS credential, those are fun. Those are things that we can do a lot of. Sometimes it's better that it's used in automation. And in automation, because your user is using it, nobody else can use that credential, so they can't actually get the password for it. So you're a lot safer when you're running it in an automated fashion, rather than leaving your workstation open and your PowerShell window up, and you've already executed those things. It's not probably a good idea to leave your workstation open anyway. All right. So then what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at some ideas of how we can leverage SMO or leverage PowerShell in doing things we would want to do. So I don't know how many of you ever add SQL Server startup parameters, but here's a little function that somebody wrote. Eric Humphrey wrote this, and basically lets you pass in a parameter of a string called startup parameter, and it defaults to -T1118. Now, if you wanted multiple ones, you could do what he's doing here with multiple -Ts. These are all things we can do from the GUI, right? But guess where they're stored? In the registry. Does this look familiar? HKLM, software, Microsoft SQL Server, and then it adds instance names, SQL, gets the properties. Get item property is how you get a D word or a string, or regSZ is what they call them. And you can actually pull them out and start messing with them and find the instance you want and change the properties. Once you get done, set item property is where you put them, and those now exist in your startup. Now, obviously, you would have to restart the instance to get those properties to take effect, but it's no different than you going into SQL Configuration Manager and popping them in there. So this is how it's done in PowerShell. Now, did you have to write this? Well, no. I mean, but did he follow my rule? Nope, he didn't follow my rule. That should be for each, and it really should be, but there's ways you can shortcut, and oh, there's the where clause. It's a question mark, that's where. So should you do that? Yes, because you might come in here and get, mistaken in lots of things, but it's a pretty short function, so you probably could convince yourself that that's okay to do. Because he put it out on the web and allowed people in it, probably should not be so callous, or cavalier. But anyway, when I run that function, all I have to do is pass in the startup parameter, and it actually runs on the computer. So it's on the computer you're in. If you wanted to do it for another machine, you'd have to use something called remoting, which we'll show you in a minute, because that's another thing that a lot of DBAs don't really understand or don't really know why you'd ever do it. But it is a pretty slick deal. And actually, I just realized I cannot show you remoting because I don't have another machine on this network that I can remote to. I'll show you the commands and you can go play with it and break something. So it's going to be fun. So that's kind of a fun little thing. But once I have this code, whether I wrote it or whether I leveraged it from somebody, I now can just use that code to go and put a SQL parameter in place. So that's kind of cool. I don't know how many of you use DAC packs, the database projects. But this is how you can actually deploy a DAC pack. So you can have a DAC pack store, open up the connection in there. You can open or create the DAC pack file, and then you, through a series of couple of commands, I can actually deploy my, I do an install, and it actually will deploy my DAC pack, all in PowerShell. So now I don't need to worry about doing other things there. And same with ICE packs. Anybody who does SSIS has the ability to create. And now again, you're going to have to add the type of assembly. So beware of here. If you were to import module SQL Server or import module DBA tools, this would already be loaded for you. So you don't have to do this statement. But if you wanted it quick and dirty, as long as this exists in the GAC, you are allowed to do that. If not, you need to specify a path instead of an assembly name. And you can load it right then and there. So if you have this DLL in your folder, then you can actually add type and then run this. But like I said, it's already part of the SQL Server management objects that come with the import module of SQL Server or the import module of DBA tools. But all it does really is connect to a server and grab a new object of integration services, find the catalog, create the folder, and then deploy it. And the way it does it, it opens and reads all the bytes into memory and then deploys deploy project. And you get it in that folder with the project file of bytes, and your ICE pack is done. Now, is it hard to write? Well, it depends. If you're good at SQL, if you're good at PowerShell, then you figure out all of this stuff. But once you figure it out one time, and it works, you can use it 100,000 times. So yes, this is daunting. And in the beginner stage, a lot of people are like, I can't write PowerShell. Holy cow, I don't know how to do that. I can write T-SQL, but PowerShell, it's too hard. So just be aware that you're going to have a little bit of a learning curve, but I wanted to show you these two first because they aren't normal, and DBAs don't necessarily think this way. You think of a connection string from an application and you like that. You think of a connection string like this. Connect database engine. That's our connection string. We're done. And it might include SQL Server authentication, maybe, but it may not. So this is not the connection string that we're dealing with. So it might be that it might be a little daunting to have to do all of this work. But I promise there's plenty of examples on the web. You'll test it in test. Make sure this is a hard-coded path. I could make that a parameter to my function. I didn't even create a function. So these are things that the benefit to this getting to the advanced stage in your PowerShell world is that you can write code. And once you write it, you now know you have documentation of how you did it. You don't ever have to wonder, how did I do that again? I keep this around because I have places where they go, yeah, we really want to deploy this ICE pack. I'm like, well, then just in your project, do right-click deploy. I mean, what are you talking about? No, I mean, I want to be able to download it, build it, deploy it. Oh, you don't want to click. You just want it to happen. And I refer back to this and it just works. It's very sweet. I don't have to remember how I did it. This is it right there. All I have to do is a path, and then these are all set up. So pretty cool thing. But there's things that you need to understand about. It's going to take some time. It might not be native, might not be something you go, yep, got it. It might be something that happens later. So just be aware. Let me see. There's one other thing I wanted to show you before we go too far, and that is the mixture of PowerShell and stuff. So I've created this get DBC SQL perf. I'm not sure if you guys know what that is, but we'll run it here. There's a SQL perf command in SQL on the DBCC side that basically will tell you your log space for the databases. Now, what it won't do is it won't alphabetize them. And it won't let you do a where clause. Where database name. Wait, it doesn't like where? What do you mean? Oh, it's a DBCC command, so you can't do that. But I know the T-SQL command. Here's DBCC SQL perf. I got it. Now how do I get this stuff? Well, you can look at it, but what if you have 200 databases and you're trying to find them, they're not ordered? That sucks. You have two options, right? You can do this create temp table, and you can exec dynamic SQL into the temp table. Then you can do a select for the where. I mean, are you kidding me? So, and I want to do it on the command line. Ooh, okay, I'm not going to write that every time, and I'm not going to have it in a spare T-SQL file. But if I had my own module I wrote in PowerShell, I might do this. Pass in my server instance name, pass in my database name. I want to know what is going on with my SQL perf. My queries right here is just T-SQL, DBC SQL perf log space. I invoke SQL CMD. I don't have to tell it that I want a table. I can just do rows. Rows is the default. So it outputs as rows, which is totally good. And so I'm getting my invoke SQL CMD for my server instance that was passed in. I do it for the database, and I do master here because the command would be run in master. The database name is for something else. If I passed in the database name, I want to give me the results where. If I didn't pass in a database name and it's null, then I want all the results. But here's my query, DBC SQL perf, comes back as results. I check the database, I where clause it or not, and I get my data back out. Okay, so we're going to execute this guy. Import module SQL Server will not happen again because it's already loaded, so that's fine. But now what I do is I go out here and I say get DBCC SQL perf. My server instance is Ben desk 1, instance 1, and my database is Ben. And I spelled it wrong, and it's going to come back and it's going to be dumb. Great. So this is why you always test it, because the command should have been in here. Let's grab that command here, put it in here so we don't lose it. Should be Ben desk, not 1. So we'll run this again. And sure enough, I only get back Ben. And I see my log size is 7.99 megabytes. My log space used is 84. Now, what can I do with this? Well, I could run this again and say where. I could omit the database name so I get all of them, right? And I can say where my log space used is greater than 50. And there's my Ben. So now I can go and I can run this command. I could put this in a function and just have it with percentage of 50 as a parameter. And it will pass all the stuff in there and it will be dynamically available so I don't have to write this where clause. And all of a sudden, I have this way to tell, anytime I run it, I can give me the idea of which log is more used than it probably should be. And most likely, Ben is a log that is on full compatibility mode, and I have done no backups. It's full compatibility, full recovery model, and I have not done any backups. According to this guy, I've done full backups, but no log. So my log's filling up. And in a little bit, it probably will grow because if I add more data, it's going to grow. But this is a little tiny function that just, it mixed T-SQL. It mixed a command I didn't have to write, and all I had to do was write the logic. We can write logic. Once you learn the syntax, you're fine. But we can write logic because we do it in T-SQL. We do if statements. We do loops. We do all sorts of things in T-SQL that maybe we shouldn't do, but we do it. And we get to combine these in PowerShell to allow us to run a command. And I could even have these set up like my config here. I could have these set up in hash tables right here and just hash table them. And then I only have to type in the parameter that's variable. And all of a sudden I'm good. I could even modify this one to have a percentage. And I would just default it to 0.0. So now if I pass in a percentage, it will then filter that out because I do a where clause where database name is that. And and I'll just do greater than percentage. If I pass it in, that's great. If I don't, greater than 0.0 is going to be true too. So I just augment this, and I will tell you that if you do an and, this is a where clause with one clause, you don't have to put the brackets in here. If you do an and, you have to. It can't do two with a where with no brackets. So you have to take these out or put these in when you do an and clause and something else. And I would get in the habit of doing this, putting parentheses around them if you're going to do an and clause, okay? So all of a sudden, I mixed two types of things, T-SQL, modules, and logic. Three things, but logic is a given, and it's normal to do that. Same thing with get SQL VLF log count. Now, there's lots of ways today to do that, but see, notice how I did a little differently. I didn't use invoke SQL CMD. I did the execute with results. How else could I have done this? Remember when we saw the extra command on the DBA tools side? DBA tools adds invoke, and it adds a query to the objects. So I don't even have to do the execute with results. I'll let it do it for me by just saying db.query, and it will do the thing for me. Same deal though. It passes back a data set, and I didn't say all tables, so it gave me the first one, and then I'd say I don't even have to count the tables like I do here, but I did this function as a SMO function. So notice everything's in SMO. I didn't even mix. I did my new object. I did my databases. I then did my execute with results. So this is all SMO. A little more coding than what we just saw, right? Well, actually a lot more coding because I had to get stuff. If I wanted that database, I could just do a get-dba database, done, or a get-SQL database. I'm done. I don't have to rewrite it. There's another one that I did that's like this. I'll show you that one. Get all VLF counts. This is an example of a hardcore guy trying to go after a one-liner. So a one-liner says results equals an empty array for each server in my server list. Go get a new object of server. For each database in the databases, get my VLF count. And there's my get SQL VLF count, my function. And then I export the CSV to the CSV. So one-liner, that's one-liner, but I can tell you that it's hard to read. I'm using aliases. GC is the get content alias. So yes, you can do it, but I just wanted to show you that this is where advanced meets crazy, because maybe you don't ever want to have to debug this, or maybe you don't want to do something this, and I'm not even going to call it advanced. I'm just going to call it crazy. One-liners can be really fun on the command line. Just don't put them in distributable code that you say this is awesome. But you can if you want to, but I just be careful. So good examples, things that you can do. Now we're going to go into a couple of examples of things that you can do from the perspective of writing functions that do something that their other functions do, but I'll explain why so you understand the logic. And again, this is more of a teach you how to fish than it is telling you that the right way to do it is this, or you should do it this way or not. That's not probably the best way to go about this approach. But I import module SQL Server in my function. I would .source this file, and we'll talk about that if you don't know how to do that. Hopefully in the advanced side you do. I call it expand DBA data file. I take a server, a database, a file ID, a file name, and the amount to add. These guys are not necessarily they're more mutually exclusive. You can either do a file ID or a file name. But I wanted to introduce you to this principle because it follows a principle that you will need to know about the pipeline. So anytime you want to write something that is pipelinable, now none of these have been pipelinable until this one actually isn't pipelinable. I will show you a function that is and show you how it works, but these begin, process, and I believe this one doesn't have an end, but there's an end. If you're familiar with T-SQL in the begin try, the begin catch, and the begin finally, that's what they are. The begin is really not quite what I just said, but it follows the same principle, so map it out. The begin actually is more of a constructor. Those of you who are object-oriented programmers or understand C# or object-oriented programming in classes, this begin is what they call the constructor. It runs once and only once when that function is invoked, whether it be the pipeline or whether you run it yourself, it runs one time. So this is a good place for setup. So SMO is equal to this string, and then I create a new server object because this one is all about my data file. I create my string here. If I were going to pass in a database object, I wouldn't do this in my pipeline function. But today, because this isn't a pipelinable thing, because I haven't made it that way, I'm going to be able to pass in my server database file ID and amount to add. And it's called expand-DBA file. Once I do that, I create my server just so I have my connection. I create it once and only once. The process guy runs once for every object in the pipeline. So if I have an array of databases and I pipe that, I get-DBA database and pipe it into this guy, and I want to expand all my database files 100 meg. I could do that by writing code the right way in this. This one doesn't work that way, and I'll show you how to do it, but this will run process for every object in the pipeline, and in this case, it's only one, because when you execute a function, you put things in the pipeline. That's what you do, and it's one. So it will run once. It basically goes and gets the database and checks it to see if it's null. So if you type in the wrong database name, it will come back and say, well, I'm not going to do anything because I write error, the database doesn't exist, and then I get out. I return from my function and say, I'm out of here, done. So that's what this is for. And the idea of it is that I'm going to use that database in this guy. I'm going to get each file in my file group, but I'm going to check every file group. So I'm going to do every file group in the file groups until I find the file ID I am looking for. Or if I passed in file ID, or if I didn't pass in file ID, I'm going to check file name. So if the file name equals file name, I'm going to dump the file out to the pipeline or the output stream to get this, and it's in this output stream. DB file equals the for each. So when I find the first file that matches my file ID or my file name, I'm going to dump it out to this guy, DB file, and break. If I don't find it, I'm going to break, and the DB file is going to be empty. It's going to be null because I didn't find it. So if I said file ID 40 and there's only 1 and 2, it's not going to find it. So then it comes in and says, if I have a database file, I'm going to do this amount to add times, remember what we talked about yesterday, everything in SQL SMO is in K, unless you're talking about the database size, which is in meg. So anytime I'm manipulating an object, it's always in K. So I times my amount to add. So if I said I want to add 8 gig, I would do 8,000. And 8,000 would be my megabytes, because that's what we do in the GUI, right? When you right click on a file or a database and do properties and do files, it says megabytes. So if I want to expand it 8 gig, I do 8,000 meg or 8192 meg. And this is what I'm doing here. It uses the same principle so that I don't have to think about conversion. So if I want 8 gig, I do 8,000 like I do in the GUI, and I times it by 1K because I need to, because I'm setting it up that way, 8,000 KB, and putting it in the ad. Remember what we ran into the other day? What if the file already grew and it grew past the point of my ad? I would get an error. So what should I do here? I should actually be doing dbfile.refresh to get my new whatever the ad is, and then I add it, and these will run decently fast, so one refresh won't really be circumvented unless you're growing by 1 meg and you're loading a lot of data. Then this might still error out. It might not, but it might if it's going to grow that fast, if you have that many sequential growths. But I add it, I add the size plus equals the, and this plus equals is something we do in SQL too, plus equals the amount to add, and then alter. If I didn't find the DB file, I say couldn't find the file ID. And this should be file ID or file name, because I can pass in a file name. And then I exit, that's it. So this function leverages the SMO world and not the object world. But I believe this one, do I do that with this one? Nope, it's still SMO as well. So this is the log file, and I only do the log files. So SMO has separated out file groups and log files because log files don't live in a file group. So it cannot find a log file in a file group, so you're kind of stuck. So I find it out of the log files and I see if the log file exists by ID. I don't allow names because the names, I just don't want to hassle with that. And most often your database file ID is 2 for your log because you just have one data file and one log file. For those that have more complicated structures, you just find out the file ID. And how do you do that? You use the, put this in the code, you use the get-dba-db file, and you're going to go to the SQL instance, and it's bendesk1 or bendesk instance 1, and my database is ben. I'm going to go here and I'm going to find out that my log file ID is indeed 2. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to use that 2 to pass into my function to expand my DB log file. So how I would leverage this is I would do an expand DB log file, and I would pass in my file ID or my name or whatever, and I would use DBA tools to get my file from here and find out what ID or find out whatever, and then get my file and then expand it. Now, what I will tell you about these particular functions is that there is actually a function called expand-dba log file, but there is no expand dba db data file. How do we miss that one? But anyway, I may decide to go write that and contribute it, but there is an expand log file. Most people let autogrow handle the data file. And if you're not a purist and don't believe in that, then you're good with that too. So expand DB file or data file doesn't matter much. I have functions for both, and I will explain now the why you wouldn't use DBA tools as opposed to using it. This function is standalone. Now I import module SQL Server because that's how I load SMO now. So if I had access to the only module SQL Server, I didn't have DBA tools on it and I couldn't get it in a relative amount of time. This script will run unencumbered and it doesn't require anything but SMO. Once I write it, I don't have to rewrite it. I just leverage it. So in this case, I call this function and it expands the log file, and I don't have to rely on modules. The other reason why this is important to understand is because if you wanted to write a function that was in DBA tools, if anybody has ever contributed to DBA tools or any other module, what you cannot assume in a public facing module that you create is you cannot assume that anything is true. You have to error check. You have to provide error messages that are comprehensive or that understood to where when you get an error, you know what went wrong. I went through and I thought, yeah, I had that. I wrote these before I did anything with DBA tools heavily, because I just needed a down and dirty quick tool to expand them because I needed it. When I said, yeah, I'm just going to contribute to DBA tools, I went out there and looked at the infrastructure that they have inside DBA tools, and it's a decent learning curve. It's not insurmountable because I learned it, but you have to be more aware that people want a pipeline. What if I want to add 8 gig to all my log files on every database? Well, then I have to, I'm not going to run the command for every dang database. I want to be able to get my databases and pipeline them because it's faster. So now I got to understand how to write a pipeline function. And it's not evil, not hard, but it is harder to not, it's harder to write a comprehensive function to share with the masses than to give yourself little utilities, little tools that help you do one thing. And you can assume a lot here. If you're working on a database, you can assume that that database actually exists. And you can assume that database is actually online. And you can assume that that server is online. DBA tools can't. It can't. It has to check and make sure all is well before it blows, because a little error message out of this one, no big deal. When you start pipelining and doing all these other things, it can be a big deal in an error, and you have to deal with that. So DBA tools is a little more hardcore, and that's when I decided that there are some things that will begin as my little pets. And eventually, if they grow up and become an adult pet, it might be time to share it with the world if it does something that somebody else hasn't done. So my expand DBA data file, I've used it enough that I mean, yes, it's not there, but maybe it's time I contribute that function and write it the way DBA tools needs to be written. And I'd be okay with that if only I could allocate the time, right? Like everybody in the world. When you get so far, you get so far. And sometimes you have to call a spade and not contribute it until you get some time. But these are examples of pure SMO. You saw an example of mixture. I'll show you another example of really lots of mixture. And where'd they go? Come on. It's probably right in front of my face. Unless I didn't put it in here, which I don't think I did. Well, we'll look at one more anyway. I will go get that and put it in here. Oh, it's sample. I think it's sample. We'll find it. But get DBA shrink info. How many of you find yourself doing this? Hey, I want to know what the log looks like or what the data files full look like. So I do shrink files, and it pulls it up, and I see this, and I have one data file name called this, and it says currently allocated 8 meg and 61% available. And you're like, okay, I now check out the log. Look at the log. Here's my log. And those of you who shouldn't have 2 log files but do, you can change them here. And you go in here and say 8 meg is allocated. I only have 15% left. Ooh, that's not good. Well, when you do this, most often you'll do this because number one, you don't have a get-dbcc SQL perf on hand. So you want to know what your log space is. And if you do have more than 100 databases or even more than 50, and it doesn't order them, so you're going to just get this gobbledygook and you can find it and then say, oh, 17, good. That's fine. You can do that. But for those who want to do it in script, I got tired of right-clicking and clicking in the wrong thing. Anybody done this? Right-click, tasks, click in the middle, and oh, it goes away. You're like, son of a gun, gotta go do it again. And click here, and then you click in the middle. Oh, good, you can't. So these are really weird things because these lines are actually items actually in the menu. So if you click them, they actually go away because there's nothing to do. So it's frustrating to click your way through it. And if I had to do it for 10 databases or 20, that's a lot of clicking. And anybody reused a click lately? I have never been able to figure out how to do that. So I can't reuse the clicks, and therefore it's useless to me because I want to do it multiple times, and clicking does not buy me a thing. So I wrote this little thing a long time ago. And it just says get DBA shrink info. Look, it's poised and ready for DBA tools because I have the DBA prefix. I'm a stud. I just should contribute it, right? Should be good. But basically it goes out and gets the shrink info, the use space in megabytes, free space in megabytes, free percent, growth type, growth megabytes, and then I add it to my list here for each file, and I can actually spit it out. So I'm going to execute this guy to load the function, and we're going to see what it outputs. I'm going to go back out here. We're going to say get-dba shrink info, and my SQL Server instance is bendesk. It's funny because I follow the DBA thing for DBA tools, but I use the SQL Server module syntax instead of SQL instance. I use server instance, even though I will tell you, DBA tools does have an alias called server instance if you want to use the same word as you would use in your SQL Server realm. So my bendesk instance 1, my database is Ben, and now I go DBA shrink info, and sure enough, I see my file 1, and it says free %61, growth type is KB, and here's my growth, and my 2 is my log, and here's my file name, here's my size 8 meg, my use space is 6.73. I only have 1.27 meg free, and so I have 15.92% free. It's a KB and 64. I can get that right then and there. Now it'd be a little different. I'd have to put a where clause on it, right? I'd have to say where file ID is equal to 2, and I'd get 2, because if I had a partitioned database where you have partitions and you have tons of file groups and stuff, you wouldn't want to be sorting through the shrink info just to get this guy. Okay, this is pretty close in nature to getting the DBC SQL perf and doing a ben, and it will tell you the log space free and the log space used and stuff like that in different words, but certainly it's available. But little things like this are really cool utilities that, again, once you write it, you get the logic right and things work right, and you use all these things, you have documented what you got, and you can run it from then on. Then you can create a module, and then you just import module, and all your commands are there instead of dot sourcing each individual file that has these functions in it. Or you build them all in one file, and then you just do dot source one file, and then you have all your functions anyway. But I usually create a module and go with it that way. So cool idea. But again, once I write it, I'm done. And I use a little funny syntax. You can look at that later. I've had to create objects, but super cool. Here's the sample of mixing the guys. So I import both of these modules, DBA tools first, then SQL Server, because I do mix them. I start my transcript because I'm a good citizen. I can dot source in PS credentials if I'm going to use it, or comment it out if I'm not. And this becomes a script. So we talked about functions. We call them tools. We now can write a script to leverage the tools. And in this case, I'm leveraging something that I wrote, and it's called Gather Stats. I've done a presentation on it. I haven't open sourced all of it yet. There's several things I'm going to do. This guy, and I'm going to do 2 of them. And these are basically, some of them are based upon Glenn Berry's scripts. But I'll show you what's behind the covers of this function so you can get an idea of what I did. But basically my goal is to create it into a module, and then it's easy deployment. It's self-contained, so I can put it in a folder and import my module without having to import it on the person's machine in doing health checks or whatever. But the idea is that, number one, I imported modules, so I'm going to use the modules and then use the tools. Number two, I could use a script to import PS credential if I had them. I .source scripts in that I have, and now I'm setting up my environment. We talked about this in the server 01 object. I do this special little thing. I don't know if you've seen this, but this creates an object. I showed you, I think, in the first day. But basically, I need name and credential. These have expanded since then, but we'll not talk about that tonight. Server 2, name and credential, and here's my server 1. Here's my server 2. Then I put them in an array like we talked about before. Here's my environment setup. I could put these in my profile or in the profile that gets loaded for this particular automation. And now I've set up my environment. I only have 2 servers and they're named prod SQL 1, prod SQL 2, and they don't have a credential. Notice I didn't say server 01 credential. It's blank, so I don't have to worry about that. And I just now have an object that has servers, and for each in server, and what I typically do, here's a little trick that I'll just throw out here. I would typically say servers, and I would say for each server in servers. And I now started to use that more prevalently. So if I'm getting a set of tables, my variable is called tables. And then I do a for each table in tables. So I always have this standard thing inside my code. And you can call it an advanced feature or advanced thought process, or you can just say, yeah, that's basic, it's all basic. The reality is you're going to have to code this, and you're going to have to come back and modify this. So if I have something that I understand better, it makes me more advanced in my world. So I output this server name to show that I'm on the server if I have 10 servers. I want to see in my transcript, that's all I'm doing, my start transcript, I see the server name get thrown out, it lands in my transcript. I see this string get landed out. I could say this if I wanted to, write host, and it would write it out there instead of returning it in the pipeline. This syntax sends it back to the pipeline. Now I'm not catching anything in this pipeline, so I don't really care. I can send it back in the pipeline. It may be less efficient because it has to create an object on the pipeline, and write host would be better. What typically happens more is if I were to run this as a function, and I created my own function, I could say write -verbose. This isn't something you typically see, but if I write verbose, then the only way I see this is if I execute this function with a -verbose, and then this will show up. If I only want it in debug purposes or to show me the money behind the covers, then I could write verbose. Right now, I'm down and dirty, just simple, dimple, pipe it out, pipeline, throw that out on the pipeline so I can see it in my transcript, and then I call my function with my server instance called server.name because that's a property. I don't use anything to do with the credential because I don't have any. And I know this, right? This is the assume everything because I'm the one running it. And I know that I don't have a credential, so I'm just going to bypass that. This is just my standard object. And then my report SQL instance of where I'm putting the data, because what this does is it actually gets the data and stuffs it in a table. And this is where you have to have knowledge of what you're doing. But in this case, this is all part of a solution. So I already have the table this is going to write to created, and I already have the table created that this is going to write to. So I know I'm safe, and it's basically on localhost. And I will show you the blown out one because I have, this is a simple one. I wanted you to see simple before you saw blowout because you may glaze over, but I can get so myopic on report SQL instance or report SQL database or whatever to be able to put them where I want them. But this is a good example of iterating over servers that I pre-set up here. So I'm mixing all these principles of dot sourcing and running and modules and transcripts and all this stuff in one script This is a script. It's a PS1, and it runs quite well. When it gets done, it stops transcript. And what I see in the transcript is this, any errors or warnings that come from this, and then any errors and warnings that come from this. What happens behind the scenes with this is it actually writes data to a table. So let's go and look at that really fast, just so we can complete this part of it. And we'll do Notepad. Oh, I could have done Azure Data Studio, doggone it. Oh, well, that's okay. So here's my get BMA iteration ID, and it basically just goes and inserts into the iterations table, outputs the iteration ID because it's an identity, and I insert the value of get date. That way I have my running number and notice. To run it, I use invoke DBA query. So I'm mixing. This is DBA query, mostly because, and actually I don't even have to do the if, I learned, but I do check if there's a SQL credential passed in. Then I use the one with the SQL credential. If there's none passed in, I just return the invoke DBA query with no SQL credential. And the other reason why I like this one for DBA query is that it allows me an as clause like the invoke SQL CMD did. It allows me an as clause to say single value, which is not something invoke SQL CMD does. Invoke SQL CMD has data rows, data table, and data set. Doesn't have a scalar, a single value part, but this one does. DBA query allows you to do a single value, which means I can return it as an ID and I catch it here. So I don't have to convert this. This is a single value. That's it. It's not an object. It's a single value that comes back and I get that value. And so one thing I haven't talked about, but we'll cover that hopefully in a minute. All right. You know what? Let's pause for any questions. Any questions from the group? Or am I just putting you to sleep or wowing you, whichever end of the spectrum you want to choose? But I don't want to be bowling over things without questions if you have them. Don't be shy. And there's no such thing as a bad question. A dumb
Okay,
question.
Ben, you've known me for a while. Shy.
Just saying. I'm just trying to be kind to the audience.
Well, I don't want to sidetrack. I tried to do the invoke DBC check earlier today on my local laptop, and I'm getting that faster. So, but we can talk about that maybe at the end.
You tried to use the invoke DBC check?
Yeah.
And it didn't work?
Nope.
Yeah. I'm not sure how to help fix this, but it is, I would call it a more advanced module, and Rob Sewell will probably kill me for saying it on recording, but I can do that. I found it, I haven't used it until late. In the very beginning, it was really challenging to me to run DBC checks. For whatever reason, there's just, when you've written it and you know how it works, you can make it work. When you come in completely green and you want to run it, sometimes it's just really hard. I don't know why, but
Well, Tracy,
what?
I was going to say Tracy Boggiano has done a thing on it, and I'm going to watch her. I'm going to watch hers and see kind of what she's doing.
Yeah, Tracy actually contributes to it, so she's down in the guts. So
yeah.
If she's doing a presentation on DBC check, you should watch that. She's a good resource. But yeah, sorry, I'm just new to this myself. It's one of those weird things. I didn't even get how to get it into the notice how it creates this JSON file. I didn't even know to do the command like that to do. I remember reading it somewhere, but I had to go find it, and I missed this part. That's why it didn't work, because I didn't do a pass through to get the data to not only get out of DBC check, but to pass through to be able to be passed into another function. So yeah, it's a great tool, but it sometimes is a little more complex than we want it to be. Any other questions? Okay. So this is basically what I do here. Now, if you're familiar with Glenn Berry's diagnostic queries, I took some of them, and I'm in the middle of a project that's going to be super fun when I unveil it. But Glenn has done a lot of work, and there's a lot of things that you can get from a SQL Server just by using his queries, and that's why he created a notebook. One day we'll have a powwow on that one. Maybe I'll do some things there, but some really cool things where he goes and gets the CPU by the minute. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to find the ones that we're using. So CPU, oh, we do CPU by the minute. That's what I thought. So CPU by the minute, I can pass in a server instance, a credential, iteration ID, a report SQL instance, a report SQL DB, and a report SQL credential. So I can pass all of that in or not in, and I could even default these to be like the report SQL DB is DBA, because that's what I do. I mean, I can assume that because I wrote it. And I basically create this here string, and here's the query. I attribute it to Glenn Berry, and I put his whole statement in this here string and end the here string. So now I've got a multi-line string, and I can pass it in. And here's what I interject. My iteration ID. Remember how I told you to put it at the end? I did. All my tables have their identities at the end. I have an identity column and I have an iteration ID column in the end of the table. So I put this in, and basically because it's a double quoted string, it will replace the ID as iteration ID. So my query comes back as iteration ID. So if I just executed it and it didn't stuff the data in, then I'm safe. So I run the query and I do the same thing. If SQL credential, then get my DT, invoke SQL CMD, blah, 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 blah. If not, then do a DT without the credential. I do them as data tables. And then I write SQL table data with the input data of DT. These are hard coded, stat and CPU by the minute, because it's a solution. The only other thing I could do differently here is not combine the get. I could get the CPU by the minute and not record it here, but return it. And then I could have another sister function that says set or write the BMA CPU by the minute. And BMA, by the way, is Ben Miller and Associates. So you know, I did my own prefix. So if anybody else gets the same idea, I can have my own function without clashing. But the get would pull me the data in a data table and return it as a data table. And my write would let me, and so I wouldn't need this in my get, right? Those I wouldn't need in the get at all. I would need the first three, but I wouldn't need the last three. And these last three would be in my write. So I could even split it out a little further to give me some flexibility if I loaded this module and I just wanted that query. And I'm giving it away, but if I just wanted that data out of the query, I should just say get CPU by the minute, and it will return me as a row set, and I can find out what that was. Show me any instance where the CPU percentage was greater than 50. How many are there? Do I care? If I get none of them that were above 50, I move on. That instance is not important to me that day. I'm looking for hot in the last 256 minutes. And if I get one, I know that if I get 256, I know the CPU is burning on that box, and that's good to know. But this is the pattern I follow with T-SQL, and then I write it. I get it and I write it. So I get it here and I write it here. I can make this a lot more robust, and I will, but this was a down and dirty, quickly write it, get things ready, make sure you can use it, and then make it into a solution you can distribute or give to people to where they can go have some fun. So this is in the works, but it gives me a great shot. I have CPU by the minute. I have IO by database. Again, Glenn Berry. I have CPU by database. Go, Glenn Berry. So I can leverage all of the things. I attribute them. They're open source. I mean, as far as he's given them to everybody and let them be, I think they're MIT licensed. So I can do all of this. I can customize them like this one. This one is all about the BMA database option info. And as you all know, different versions of SQL have different options in the database category. When you do sys.databases, they've added some. And I'll tell you that SQL 2008 has, it's terrible. I don't do 2005 or 2000, but 2008, I just rather forget that instance type. Because I do work on 2008 R2s, it is important to make sure I put the query together. And with this kind of stuff, I may rethink how I'm doing it, but because I'm getting errors. But wait stats, here's the key to this piece. There are two parts to this, and one is server-based and one is database-based. Whenever it's server-based, you'll always see this. It's just boom, 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 done. Whenever they're database related, like table statistics, these I want them for each database. I have this nice long, and this one I actually wrote, so I don't attribute it to anybody at this point. But it's a big long bunch of T-SQL, and then I get my data, I get my instance. Then for each database, if I'm doing it for a database alone, then I do that database. Where is accessible equals true, where the name is not in master, and give me the name. And then for each DB, and I could do databases, and for each database in databases, and then I start running the invoke SQL CMD, and I start writing the data tables. Done, 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 and done. Okay. I do assume some things because you notice that there's no credential here, but I am assuming that in my case, I haven't, like I said, there's lots more to do, but this is the down and dirty. I assumed that when I'm going to run against and push it into my DBA database, that I already know what I'm using Windows credentials. I'm not going to use SQL credentials. So I assumed that, and I didn't modify this. But this is the difference for each database, rather than just stuff it in one shot because the query only relates to an instance. So all of these functions are in this gather stats guy, and it allows me to put them in here. So the real one, I'll show you the real one where this is just a sample of what I do in here, but I think I guess I have to get it from the main process here. So here, and maybe this one is the wrong one. I'll have to look at it and see. Yep, that's still the wrong one. So anyway, there's one with a lot more with the report SQL credential and all that stuff in here, but I don't have it in this file, so I will not be showing that tonight, I guess. Here's my schema table creation, so I can create my tables to run it. But anyway, this is a template for you if you're going to do multiple servers, put them in one object, or separate. One could be prod, one could be dev, one could be QA or stage. And you have QA servers, you have dev servers, you have prod servers, and you know now, because you know your environment, you now can put that in a config file like this, db config, configure it all. And in your profile, you .source this config, put it in a central location, put it on a share, whatever you do. But you can now use this file, dbconfig, as a import or a .source, so that your configuration of your prod SQL and your dev SQL and your QA SQL and all that stuff, your SSAS servers, all of that is in a config so that you document, number one. Two, leverage it everywhere you go. And now you don't have to do anything about, I want to look at all my servers that are prod. Now, if you have a central management server, that works too, because we saw it the other day on get-dba reg server, and it will get you the registered servers. And you can do by group. You specify a group and it will pull only that group. So if you've done that due diligence, then you can do that. But if you need to use credentials, you can set them up in here and separate them out with dev, QA, and stage and prod and all that stuff. And now you don't have to worry about it. If you add a server, go add it to the centralized DB config and you run with that. So that's a really, really big piece, I think, to help you out. And I'm going to show you one last one just to show you some of the things you can do that are a little more cool. We had this project where I know you guys probably don't ever have this happen to you, but if you do, I feel bad for you because I lived through it. I'm still living through it. We're not done. But the idea of what happens if you have a SaaS platform, or you have many of the same databases, or many of the databases that you use with DAC packs. So say you have a database project and you deploy. And in our case, in one of my customers' place, we have a lot of databases that are identical, or I'll say should be identical. In development, they deploy regularly with DAC packs. Just SQL deploy and boom, done, and it just goes, and that database gets what it gets. When we go to prod, there's too many databases that are all the same. In dev and QA and stuff, they have just one database that is for that database project, and they deploy it. In prod, we actually like to have names that are consistent. So if anybody has ever seen the table creation script that says create table, ID, int, not null, primary key, comma. Okay, what just happened? What just happened was your SQL object was named automatically. And if you've ever seen the names that it picks automatically, it isn't pretty. It consists of, and those of you who don't know, you'll learn. And those of you who do know, just turn off your ears. If it's a primary key, it is PK, 2 underscores, part of the name, underscore the object ID in hex, underscore, and I think there's one more thing on it. And that's it. I mean, it's terrible. So if your object ID is not the same in every database, your PKs are named differently. They're a different name. I mean, it's like, okay. So how do you tell if the primary key is on that table when you go and check? Well, you have to do a lot of work or buy a tool like Redgate and tell it not to ignore the names. If you buy Redgate SQL Compare, you can tell it not to recognize the names and just look at the definitions and tell me what's different. In a normal world where you don't have access to that tool, you look at the name and go, well, just go see if that name is there. Well, that name's not there because it's different in the database you deployed to as it is the database you put in prod. So I had this project that said, crap, I hate this. I don't like this. We're going to go on a renaming indexes spree. So we created this naming index or naming convention that basically said, put the type of index, PK, IX, UQ for unique. Column store would be, I think it was CL, CS for clustered column store, NC, CS for non-clustered column store. I mean, we just named the prefix was there. Then we did an underscore, and then the schema underscore the table name, and then 2 underscores, the first column name in the key, underscore, second column, until we got to 128. And then we were out of space. And we just did it up to that point. But the PK is typically 1 column. And the table usually isn't 128 characters long. So you can get away with renaming indexes. So basically this piece basically goes and does this SMO, creates a server. I pass in server instance, database, table, and schema, because we had certain tables that we really cared about. If I wanted to omit this and do all of them, I would just omit the table and schema and say, You go on every table that's a non-Microsoft ship table and you rename all the indexes. So basically, I wrote this code. It basically says, hey, if I don't have a database, I don't care, I'm going to return. If the database is not accessible because it's read-only, or it's not accessible because it's offline or suspect or whatever, then don't touch it. But now I'm going to build a list of all the things that I'm going to enact my thing to say if my index key type is primary key, then write verbose primary key if I'm running this on myself. If it's clustered, then I write PK. If it's non-clustered, then I write PKNC. So it's primary key non-clustered. If it's a unique key of DRI unique key, not primary key, then use UQ. Or the fail-safe is it's not unique, it's not clustered, then it's just an index, IX. And I go and join these things. Now look at this cool thing. The keys I can get from the keys of select property of my key list. The keys come from index columns. Where is included is equal to false. Then my include columns are included where the index columns where is included equals true, and I sort them by name because it really doesn't matter what order the include columns are in because they're just leaf columns. They're not anything else. So I get all my names, check my key types, join these keys, which is a shortcut, to get underscore underscore between all of the keys and all of the include lists. And then I start doing anything. If somebody put a comma in the dang thing, I replace them. If somebody put a bracket in the name, I replace them until I get to the point where I can include all of the things with include. And I don't think in this one, I actually don't limit the name, because what I want to find out is, number one, if we have dupes, because the name will already exist, because it's fully named. And then if it isn't, then I do the new name equals a new name. And I keep the index URN, just so you know, we taught about URNs, and I'll tell you why. Once I set the new name, I add it to the list. So I've actually created me another object saying index URN, a new name, for the purpose of renaming. Remember what I told you about deleting objects? You've changed the collection when you do a iteration over an SMO tables collection and you try to drop the table and it drops the first one, then says, hey, you can't proceed because you modified my collection. Indexes are the same way. If I try to change the name of an index in a loop, it will hate me because I can't rename an index because I've just changed the thing. So here's where the URN trick comes into play. For each item in my list, because I did my list, I'm not trying to rename my listed item because I said for each table. I didn't do that. And I said for each index in table indexes. I didn't do that. I basically get a new object, server.getSMO object for my URN, and I index rename new item. So now it's an independent standing object because I got it. I'm not modifying the list or the collection object. And now I get to rename it. Here's what happens. When I run this, what happens if I have duplicate indexes? Well, it will refuse to rename the index. So now I go back and I look at the indexes and I can just see it. Everything's nice and pristine with my naming convention, and then there's one that's not. I can safely drop that one because it aired out and I can just drop it as a dupe. So it was built dual purpose. But again, this is something that you might write as an advanced PowerSheller. It isn't trivial, but again, once you fight through it and you write it, you get better at writing it. That's number one. Number two, when you get done writing it, you now have documentation of how you did it. So if you ever have to do anything like this, and I give you a hint, foreign keys, if you ever have a need to go and use this kind of thing again, you can leverage your code. This is a very specific thing that does the work. It doesn't return me what the name should be. it actually renames the index. So after all tonight and yesterday and the day before, hopefully you've learned some things that you can do with doing the work, expanding a data file, expanding a log file, renaming indexes, pulling up your DBC SQL perf so that you can get that information. All of these things are not mandatory for you to learn. There's something that you choose to learn. And as a DBA, you can go and tell everybody that you learned these things and it's all happy. And others would say, I'm a DBA and I really don't care to learn that. And that's okay. We're not in this to force PowerShell down anybody's throat or into their keyboard. But I will tell you, just by the little stuff I showed you tonight, yesterday, and the day before, if it doesn't give you a thirst for PowerShell as a DBA, then maybe it isn't for you. But for me, I have gotten so much more done. And we didn't even get into some of the guts of PoshRS job, the advanced stuff of import Excel. The other one I think you should really learn about is remoting. In fact, I think I might do a remoting one for DBAs just to show you the power of DBA remoting. There's really not a whole lot of commands. There's invoke-command, so if you want to look that up. And there's an enter PS session or enter PS session or invoke command. And then there is you can actually import PS session and bring in modules that you don't have on your machine from another PS session. So you could actually load modules in a session and import them into your environment for that session, for that time. But you can leverage modules that are on a machine that you don't have on your machine. So remember how I told you that what if you can't download the DBA tools? What if you can't download SQL Server? Because they're freestanding, they're actually allowed to be imported into your session so that you can leverage them even though they're not installed on your box. So remoting, those three things alone are worth everything. Today, I actually needed to add somebody to 4 machines to the administrators group so they could run some commands. And it ran from a job and it failed. So I fired up and said invoke-command. And I said the computer name is 4 machines. So comma separated list of 4 machines. And my script block was add-local group member with the group as of administrators, my member as the member. I hit enter and it went for all those 4 machines and it added it to those 4 machines administrators group. And I was done. I didn't have to log in with remote desktop. I didn't have to do any hocus pocus with PS exec. I just did remoting and it just worked. I didn't even have to enter PS session. I just did the invoke command and it implicitly created its own sessions to run that command in. And it doesn't even have to be that simple. It can be a lot of things. But remember how I told you that you could use those commands to go parallel? Invoke command is parallel. So if you did invoke command, it might do them in the wrong order because it might take server 2 longer or shorter than server 1. So you might see server 2's results come back faster than server 1, but it will fire them out and it'll do them all at the same time and let you have things done immediately. So super cool things. Hopefully this was helpful. I tried to think of things that you would do in a regular everyday life and show you some code that showed that. There's tons more we could do, but hopefully it was enough. So that's my presentation for today. And I thank you for attending, and we'll look forward to another time when we can come and do some more PowerShell. Maybe in person. That would be fun. So Pat, back to you.
Thanks a bunch, Ben. I'm gonna quick turn down the recording here, and then if people have questions, they can pop up and don't need to worry about exposing all of their secrets through the recording.
Great.